Hello, welcome to 50-Minute Hour. My name is Corey. Today I'm joined by Seraphim. Seraphim, what are we
Hello.
drinking today?
I am drinking an apple cider mixed with vodka. It's okay. What are you drinking?
Doing a slightly dirty martini. We are speaking from the same house, but we are in different rooms. We're sick of this recording. We don't have Calvin. He got married and he's quite busy. And we moved. We bought a farm, and we're way out in Appalachia.
Is this the update?
Yeah, so that and we've been quite busy with all that, selling at farmers market and dealing with the land. We have chickens and everything, and so we apologize. We haven't been very present. We did do a recording with one of Seraphim's. Was it a friend from seminary?
No, it was a brother of an old roommate of mine.
Okay,
Who's
and
the son of a priest.
I see. And in that we talked about anarchism and Max Stirner, education,
Feminism a bit.
feminism, and he had me read Abdullah Öcalan, who's this imprisoned Kurd writer, intellectual, anthropologist. But we have not been able to get those files organized and uploaded. So this is going to be the first podcast really in a while since we've moved.
Yeah, we had the files. We had it basically ready for publication, and then when I went to Corey to confirm the edit, the files were suddenly all gone, so we have to refine the files, re-edit them. I think it will be up at some point. Calvin is probably no longer going to be part of this podcast, even though he's been the consistent sort of host. He did get married last summer to a very lovely lady. It was a very lovely wedding, and he's kind of off doing his own thing. He does hope to come back here and there, maybe to be a part of it, but he's just got too much going on. So right now I'm trying to fill in his shoes and try to maybe take on some of the hosting aspect.
And you'll be doing the editing, right?
Apparently I am. So
and well, you said you wanted to.
Yeah, I do actually want to. Yeah, as long as I don't lose any more files. So.
And beyond Calvin being married, it was also that a big boon of him was his expertise and all the technology he had that he would bring in person. And since we live 2.5 hours from Lexington, I don't expect him to make that trek. We really are like in the middle of nowhere. We're right below the Ohio River, about 5-minute drive. And there is a small town across the river from us. But beyond that, we don't even live in the town proper that we are in Kentucky. We live outside of it. But that town has less than 1,000 people in it. So we're pretty in the boonies. But we have the farm we have is 10 acres, much of which is forested, and we're in the process of getting those trees cut down. And so we probably have about half an acre of working land at the moment, and we still have a lot of sunlight issues because of the tree. So it's really nothing at the moment, I would say. But I am working farms elsewhere, totaling about 1.5 acres in Lexington and 2 different areas in Lexington. But eventually I'd like to turn this into like my main, I'll terrace the farm, the mountain, but the house itself and everything is actually on the mountain. So it's like a cliff and we're on the mountain itself, and it's very beautiful out here. And we've been here since Christmas of last year. So, what is that? About 10 months almost.
Yeah, well, it's about 9.
9 months. Okay.
Well, no, 10 months actually. Yeah, 10 months because we started in December, and it was a very fast process. I found a property for sale one day at work,
very cheap,
on Facebook Marketplace. Yeah, I like to scroll through Facebook Marketplace, and I was at work. I was bored, and I saw this like 10-acre place with a nice house on it, very much affordable. And I sent it to Corey, not really thinking much of it, but I'm just like, oh, we should buy this. And Corey was right away like, yeah, we should. Let's
I saw the 10 acres for how cheap it was.
Yeah. I mean, we'd kind of been looking casually, but this just came, and it was very affordable and what we were looking for. And I think I saw it on Monday.
Appalachia too.
Yeah, it's in Eastern Kentucky, and we've been wanting to go down there. And so I think I found it on a Monday, and I think by Friday we had an accepted offer, and we were already in the process of buying it. So it was a very fast process. That was in November of last year, and yeah, a lot's gone on since then, which is why we have not been able to really record, and we're hoping to get back into it.
And for those of you not too familiar with Appalachia itself, so like most of Eastern Kentucky is Appalachia, and there's two different types. There's like actual geographical Appalachia, which is like you're in the mountains, and there's cultural Appalachia. Lexington, Kentucky, which is where we were living, is like right on the border. It's not technically in cultural Appalachia, but it's you go over one county and you're in cultural Appalachia. So like I grew up from a family that was Appalachian, my dad's side at least. My mother's side was French, Rhode Islander, Canadian, French Canadian, but my dad's side was Appalachian in his sort of culture and heritage. White trash, but as some might say. So Lexington itself has become more and more Yankee in the past 10, 20 years. So it's really lost any aspect of that really tied it to Appalachian culture, I would think. But again, you just go over to the right, a few miles and you're in there again. But we're not merely in the cultural area. We're actually in the mountain part of it now as well.
Right.
So
yeah.
We're deep in there.
Yeah. So we do hope to get back into it for people who listen. Thank you for your patience. And we do want to get back regular with it. We did have we did record a whole podcast. We lost the files. We're trying to get those pieced back together. So we do want to get back into it. And this is kind of our attempt to try to do so. And I guess here we go.
And if you or anyone would want to be interviewed for a pod on a particular topic you're knowledgeable or at least have interest in opinions about, just let us know in the comments, or you can email me, I guess, at cbanta125@msn.com, and we can go from there. So
I think we want to start with a video that you wanted to talk about before we went into the main subject. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, we're not going to show the video, obviously, but it was well, before I get there, I want to give two shout outs. One is a shout out just as a recommendation to this YouTube channel we're getting this video from. It's called Farming Explained. I really disagree with much of what he says, but he does a very good overview of like the history of politics and philosophy of farming. He's some British guy. He's a dairy farmer. The other shout I want to give, which is if you enjoy
Did you know
podcast,
the name of his YouTube?
That's it. Farming Explained.
Oh, okay.
Farming Explained is the name of the channel. The other shout out is a podcast called Art of Darkness that I become a big fan of, and I think if you enjoy this podcast, you'll probably like them. They just cover a lot of artists, and they're doing they did a 5-hour one on David Bowie, and they did one a while ago where they had this expert on Cormac McCarthy come to talk about Blood Meridian. So they do literature and art, and they focus on like the biography of the artist and like the dark things that channel that into great art. But it's really enjoyable and enlightening. So anyway, going back to Farming Explained, he's done a series of videos going over the fascist history of organic farming. And he did one recently that I wanted to talk on. Did you want to introduce it in any way, Seraphim?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm sure you're going to do the bulk of the talking, but he did release one recently called "Is Organic Farming a Cult?" And the thumbnail is very interesting. There's a picture of Thanos on it. There's another person who I don't recognize. It's probably one of those aristocrats that he mentions in the video. Corey, you may know who it is. But there is a picture of Thanos on it, and the quote on the thumbnail is "Too many people?" ? And the kind of premise of the video in general is him kind of critiquing a lot of the organic farming movement and the idea to do more sort of less industrial practices of farming that's supposed to be better environmentally. And his point is that that's impossible to really do without vast decline in population. And he's saying that those who initially advocated this idea were fascists who wanted decline in population, want to decline in certain unseemly population, and that modern, I mean, I hope I'm not misquoting him, but a lot of modern people advocating for this, to his surprise, actually also kind of agree with that initial sort of fascist philosophy. And he's basically saying that if
they don't consider themselves fascist, though, right? That's his point.
Right, but he also makes the point that a lot of the arguments he feels like they make on his like YouTube comments, which to be fair is not going to be the cream of the crop of people of that movement, right? Because YouTube
actually his videos have some of the higher discussion I've seen in YouTube comments. I think because the interest is so specific. It's a Venn diagram of people into farming and history of philosophy, basically.
Yeah, and so his point is basically like people are kind of arguing from that point, whether consciously or not, that in order to make it be sustainable, you have to have population declining, and he's sort of arguing that that's fascist. It has fascist roots, and that organic gardening has its organic farming has its place, but it obviously can never be a substitute for industrial farming, which is far more maximizes production, because that is what is needed to sustain the population as we have it. And so you can't do the one without massive population decline, and you either have to accept that or not. So that's kind of his premise in that. And I know you had some things to say.
Well, yeah, so there's a lot to disentangle. So he really anchors himself to this term organic, which, as someone who works in a farm that is in the process of being, not my farm, the farm I work with in a cohort, in the process of being certified organic, I can say regenerative or natural farmers or traditional farmers, whatever word you want to use, and these all mean different things depending on who you ask. It's very complicated language, but by far the word that gets the most cynicism is organic. So he in a way he's preaching to the choir here. Like, even people who do, let's just say non-conventional, non-industrial farming, do not like the term organic for a variety of reasons, not necessarily the fastest origins. Regarding that, I mean, that seems to be true from what I understand in Britain. That's not really the case with its origins elsewhere. Like in America, that comes out of biodynamic stuff with Rudolf Steiner, which is a bit woo-woo and definitely comes out of the same, let's say, German idealistic occultism that also was in vogue that gave rise to Nazism. The other thing that if you boil down his argument, and I'm going to go through this step by step, but if you boil down what the conversation is really about is whether people should put their faith in technology to support and to continue to support what is an artificially propped up population that relies on an urban lifestyle and basically takes all the work of farming and puts on a very small minority of the population, which, speaking historically, is a very novel idea of how to run society, right? And whether you should allow that system to collapse sooner or later in order to avoid a progressively increasing disaster. So this is kind of what Ted Kaczynski argues. It's like, look, same thing Marx is arguing in a different way. Same thing Freud is arguing in Civilization and Discontents. We have created industrial society, which is just not sustainable for one reason or another, depending on which theorist you ask. It's a different reason. But in either case, like something has to give at some point. And when that gives, the longer we have waited and the longer we artificially delay that giving, the worse and more catastrophic that's going to be. So some people, right, you go into the conspiracy places and people are like, oh, this is what the elites are doing. They're trying to find ways to reduce the population through like vaccines and all this stuff, right? Well, maybe, I don't know. But in either case, it's like they're kind of running on that same idea, at least at base, this sort of Malthusian principle. For Malthus, it's just the way farming works and the way food works, that you can't sustain a continually increasing population. But for Ted and Freud and Marx, there's kind of more nuance and different reasons for that. In either case, supposedly this is what the elite of the world are kind of working on, this Malthusian principle. So in a way, this British guy is kind of responding to that idea, and he critiques that. And I think in some ways he's correct to critique the Malthusian aspect of it. But I think he also plays into it. So for example, he's saying that the switch from conventional to organic farming, well, again, he calls this organic. I'm thinking more conventional, or what Fukuoka would call natural farming, and which is far more than just merely organic. But he's basically, when he says organic, he means not using fertilizer, are using imported fertilizer in a high scale, which you need industrialism in order to do, because otherwise you're just using poop or whatever from your farm, or a fellow farmer or something. And if you're not doing that, all the agricultural scientists agree that with where farming is right now, we cannot support the population, which is true. But he cites all these statistics, which are all assuming, regardless, I don't think they even take into account like imports and exports and stuff for Britain at least. But even beyond that, on a much bigger scale, the assumption is like we just take everyone who is currently not farming and in an urban environment and suddenly change all the farms to a non-industrial, organic or whatever, and that's just it. But of course the practical and that's how he understands, like, if we did that, well, yeah, of course a lot of people are going to die. But it's this assumption he kind of has there, which he never, I don't think he ever really explicitly says, which is that in this world, all these people are not suddenly farming. The whole idea with the regenerative movement is not simply this is how farmers who are farming ought to farm. It's the idea that the historical novelty of changing the vast majority of the population from a farming to a non-farming population was a huge mistake. That on a spiritual, psychological, philosophical, political level, it has done disasters to the human race. So it's not merely, and he does say that a lot of the fascist origins of the return to the soil movement was kind of like this, though with a lot of racial Darwinian baggage gone into it, and that we should return to the sort of feudal peasant class. And I'm like, okay, but that it's not like that's the only option. Like there are ways to not exist in an industrial society that are not going to be fascist, right? And also, like, feudalism also isn't necessarily fascist anyway. So it's like you can also separate those two. In any case, I think what he's basically saying, when you boil down the ideology, is that if you don't support industrial liberal capitalism, you are de facto a fascist, because if what industrial liberal capitalism has done is create an enormous amount of wealth in high concentrations and a lot of booming of the population, which most people nowadays will argue is a good thing, right? And therefore, if you were to stop that for whatever reason, a lot of people are going to die. So it's basically like we've created this world through liberal capitalism, and if it turns out liberal capitalism isn't the ideal system to operate on, and you critique that, you are just automatically a fascist. That's basically the hole he's kind of dug. Like, you can't, there's no way to critique doing farming in a non-industrial way without falling into this camp of fascism, merely because you are therefore causing a decline in population, which again, I don't think is even necessarily true. But even if it were, again, every society in history, including our own, has some standard for who lives and who dies through war, through criminology, through abortion. So like every society is already doing this, including ours, including whatever society he's doing with Britain too. But whatever's going on over there right now. So it's kind of a bad argument, I think. And it's like, so let's even assume the worst case scenario, that if we switch to a non-conventional farming, like, people are going to die. I mean, I guess, but the only people who would really die at that point are the ones who can't farm, which I think is a small minority. Like, maybe nowadays because everyone's fat and paraplegic or whatever. But that was just the way most people lived for most of history. And again, the assumption here is that moving away from a culture or society that was based in farming to one where everybody's working a 9 to 5 is inherently a good thing. I think it's a big unquestioned assumption.
Right. And I think that's the point. It's like that he doesn't realize that, people who advocate for this style of farming, it's like, oh, you can't sustain this modern culture. It's like, and I think one of the assumptions in that video is, well, population has to decline this much in order for this, style of farming to sustain it. But it's assuming that we live our life exactly as we do now. And that may be a critique for, and I do think this is maybe who he's aiming at, people who just are like, we have to only do organic farming, and like that's their only point. And he's like, listen, you have to give in a little. Like, you can't just do organic farming and live in our society. But I think the point, you make and a lot of other people make is, we need to really redefine how we are living as a society, as a culture, and we need to be all more, doing more agriculture. And his numbers really only reflect kind of, can we sustain society as it exists with this type of farming? Yes, obviously we can't. We have to rethink how we organize agriculture and commerce and society. And, who knows exactly what that looks like, but he's envisioning a certain scenario in his video.
Yeah, and his intuition is correct. Like whatever happens, even if it's not a population decline, is radically different than the society we have now.
Right.
It is.
And he's
not,
a little.
It's not really in a society that has electricity and running water available to most people. And it is true that the vast majority of people in the first world would be very much against any sort of political system or cultural system or return to the land system that means that. The sad truth is that we're going to go back there whether we like it or not. Right now, we arguably have the option to do that as peacefully as possible, or we can, put it off and just await an extremely violent famine where people are raping and eating each other. So my point is, like, people are probably going to die off either way, and we can do it the easy way or we can do it the hard way.
Right. And I think the point, in this video, if when we're going to watch it, that, could kind of be attacked, is like, he kind of makes the assumption, well, obviously he doesn't say this explicitly, but there's sort of this assumption of like, obviously this is the culture and environment we want to live in. And the other environments, the other cultures being put forth are either aristocratic or fascist or somehow kind of subjugating the little guy. And that's the only way in which these systems work. And don't we obviously want to live in this system? And therefore, in this system, we can't do that. And it's kind of, taking for granted the fact that actually this system may be also really, really bad. And we need to reform how we're doing it.
And also still has slavery and aristocrats. I mean,
exactly.
This is the basic ideology in liberalism, is that we've moved beyond all these terrible things in the past, like oppression and slavery and aristocracy. And the truth is that we've just kind of like made them more covert, or we've actually made it even worse. I think actually one example of this is like what Jesus says with slavery, which is that it's much better to be a slave who knows he is in chains than a slave who sees his chains as his emblem of freedom. And so what we kind of shifted to is a slavery where people think they're actually free, but they're just as much as enslaved as before. I think
if
also
not more so.
If not more so, and because especially when you think about it metaphysically, like with passions and everything, and you can say that the society we live in is the society of Descartes, who inverses Augustine's statement that as many passions a man has, he has masters, and therefore you can be the freest person in the world as a slave, and the most enslaved person in the world as a tyrant, and that's literally Plato's argument. But I think ultimately what we have here, was, along with the ideology of like liberal capitalism, is this extreme, naive optimism, which I think also undergirds a lot of liberal capitalism, is like, we can just keep doing this indefinitely. Like eventually we'll get cold fusion, we'll go to space, we'll do gay space communism, space is real. It's like this progressive, everything's going to be okay. We just and like that ideology, especially if you're American, but I guess if you're British too, is so deeply ingrained into the psyche. And it's funny, I think, especially as an American, seeing how that's obviously collapsing around us. Like, we have been face to face with that for the past 10 years, that this is a bunch of bullshit, and it's causing people to go schizophrenic because we have this ideology of optimism so deeply ingrained in us, when optimism is literally, I think, like the most retarded philosophical position. I mean, it depends on what you mean by optimism. I always say I'm a metaphysical cosmic optimist, but I'm a pessimist about everything else. Well, sorry, were you going to say something?
Well, yes, and you're starting to transition into, I know what we're wanting to really, the meat of what we're wanting to talk about, but I want to say something. I want you to comment on it. Is one thing I've been thinking of, seeing that video and kind of thinking about all this, is Christopher Nolan's Interstellar and the philosophy behind that. Have you ever seen that movie?
No,
Corey?
I haven't.
See that? Okay, well, maybe we can't really dive into that then. But there's this sort of understanding with that, whereas the world is dying, and actually, like, most people are farmers because they're just trying to keep crops going. and the main character, Matthew McConaughey, who's this kind of, sage guy who used to be like, before times got bad and everyone had to farm to sustain themselves. He used to be like an engineer, and now he has to farm like everyone else. And the point of the film is he gets approached, and he's kind of upset about things. And now the modern thing in schools is like, this moon landing, all that was fake, and that was just a thing to defeat the communists. And he's kind of pissy about that. And basically, he complains, and there's a line, it's even in the trailer for the film, where he says, we used to look up at the stars and, like, I'm misquoting it, but like, wonder what we could do, and now we just look at the dirt, and we used to look at the stars, now we just look at the dirt. And he's kind of upset that we're not advancing or whatever. And anyways, and so the point of the film, he ended up going to space and saving humanity by finding like a new, so in theory, kind of place to live, that humanity can abandon Earth and go out into space and whatever. That's the whole sort of plot. But I just kind of thought, I don't know. I mean, that's very that's very like Roddenberry Star Trek kind of, if we don't look towards the future and towards technology and towards being able to leave the Earth, we're going to all die. And people kind of around him are like, you just need to focus on your farming, because that's what's sustaining us. He's just like, this is not really sustaining us, and I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of interested in what your thoughts. I mean, I thought you had seen the film, but I kind of want to see what your thoughts are.
I can say philosophy. A bit on Star Trek, and also Zizek comes in here again as well. Star Trek is another version of the apocalyptic genre. And what I mean is like, so Zizek's point is like what you see in modern cinema, and for Zizek, like every era has a art form that is the pure form or explication of its ideology. So, for instance, in Italy, in the 18th century, this was opera, or may have been theater in Greece, out of Greece. And in our age, it's film. So you understand the pure unconscious ideology of the people through film for Zizek. And what he says is like there's a reason that the zombie and the apocalypse films manifest as they do, and it's because we don't have the capacity to imagine, because ideology is so deep, the liberal ideology is so deep in us. We don't have a capacity to imagine any alternative other than just the mere destruction of society altogether. Now, in addition to that, there's also the escapist fantasy. And the escapist fantasy, it tends to get rid of the capitalist aspect. So it tends to go to a more socialist or communistic form. But it very much maintains this liberalism, which historically is not how communism manifests. The leaders of communist countries are almost always socially conservative. I mean, at least by today's standards. But what you get this fantasy, I think, fulfilled in the most pure, all-consuming mother, speaking in terms of Jung archetype sort of idea in Star Trek. And I think there's a reason, if you don't already know this, but there's a big overrepresentation between pedophiles and Star Trek fans. And I think a part of this is because the ideology of pedophilia, with the narcissistic reaction to the overbearing mother, is also what feeds very much into a sort of socialistic, communistic, mommy take care of me state. And what you see in Star Trek from the very few episodes I've seen is this sort of fantasy as like, oh, we don't have to deal with liberal capitalism anymore. We've gone beyond the Earth, and now we have like this mommy that gives us all our resources, and we put the food and the technology, and it comes out as like the perfect meal, and everything's more or less provided for beyond extreme exploratory existential dangers. Not unlike Huxley's Brave New World, where it's like if you want to have that exploratory adventurous nature, and you want to be a philosopher or whatever, guru, you can go to the island where they keep everyone, all the dissidents. But for the most part, everyone's content to just be fed by mommy state, which is just killing all the drive of the human spirit. This is exactly what Ted Kaczynski and even Freud talks about.
Interesting.
I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I just think this role in cinema of like space as the alternative to apocalypse is basically what's happening ideologically.
I guess for Nolan, who I don't think is really thinking out some of those things.
Well, the point of ideology
like that line, which is like, now we used to look at the stars. We used to look at the stars and what we could do, but now, oh man, now we're stuck looking at the dirt and what we can farm. But it's kind of like, it should be the opposite of that. It's like, stop trying to go out there in the stars. Like, that's fine. I mean, respect the stars. And we've had our own astrology podcast and all that. But it's like, actually focus on the dirt a little bit, focus on the farming. It's kind of the opposite of what that movie kind of says.
Well, yeah, and a point of ideology is that it functions unconsciously for the director, the artist.
Yeah.
At least in many cases. There are a few directors who function consciously. Terrence Malick, Lars von Trier. But who are also, in my opinion, like the most religious directors who are actually doing decent film. I would say great film even in their case. But anyway, right. So I think we wanted to shift towards just pessimism and optimism as a sort of critique. And I guess what I see, I think the basic mode, the like primal psychological mode of humans as a species is pessimism. I think this is how we are programmed in the natural world. And what I mean by this is like we're programmed to prepare for the worst case scenario and to socialize and thrive and build and do art and do religion and do most of our activities in response to that natural pessimistic. I think this is how we're designed, basically. I think what happens in the Enlightenment is that there's this psychomagical force that is imposed on us demonically by this sort of demon of optimism. And what optimism says, what optimism says it is, and what it function as is two different things. And what optimism ends up functioning as is it's kind of like what happens with Kant in philosophy, which is that philosophy is transformed from this thing with Socrates or Plato, which this thing that is at eternal war with the state, with the polis, to something that is now a appendage of the state. So philosophy transforms from something that is anarchistic by its nature to something that is a envoy of the state. And the state and the nation state becomes manifested in philosophy, in modernity, through Kant, through Hegel, and all the philosophers that follow from there. Optimism, likewise, takes a primal force and runs against it. It takes this belief that, and instead of this inherent skepticism, or not skepticism in the sense the Enlightenment used it, but let's say the skepticism of most people's intentions, and pessimism, this sort of natural primal identity that thrives before nation states. Suddenly, you have this idea that the state replaces religion, the state replaces God. That's really what the ideological function of optimism is. It's the idea, or as the philosophers say, the immortization of the eschaton. It's the idea that we don't really, and you get this in Masonry is a big philosophical proponent of this, a progenitor, is that you don't need God or heaven in order to manifest desirable outcome. You only need the correct political situation, the correct political science. So it's basically liberalism, by which I mean that and fascism may be arguably as well, but at least it's more manifest for modern audiences through what liberalism is trying to do, which is that through the invisible hand of capitalism, through allowing, permitting everything, things will work out in such a way through some minor nuanced political aptitude of politicians and bureaucrats that we can create a system that is sufficient for human salvation and healing and prosperity, which again I think is a very novel idea, because I think the way the state functioned historically, pagan, Christian, whatever, was this is what we have to do in order to permit the development of the soul in the correct way for the afterlife, or the correct way to immortalize spiritual values and virtue in this world, in order to, not from a political level, but more so from like a Confucian idea of like the virtue of the family of Te from the king, the virtuous force of the king that runs off into the family unit produces virtue, and the virtue guarantees the prosperity of the state. So the idea was more so that a political function was really how to do ritual correctly, political ritual, political art, and that doing that in response to the worst possible scenario. Whereas now we've shifted to this idea of optimism, and that we don't really need any of the virtues or any of the or virtue in a more metaphysical, classical sense at least. We don't need religion in any higher beyond some sort of Kantian notion of You do your religion, I do mine, and we don't need any of that. We just need this sort of secular cultural state to exist that permits politicians more or less total control of the system in order to attain a sort of theocratic utopia. Theocratic because there is a God behind this, right? There's an ideology, there is a religion behind this. Whereas pessimism is totally antagonistic to that. Pessimism is a total distrust, and this is something as an American I've been so surprised by, because I think the greatest advantage culturally of an American is this very professed pessimism of the state. It's a professed pessimism, and most of the founding fathers, they are constructing a state, even as Masonic as they are, it's amazing, with the assumption that the state is never going to degenerate. And so what do we do in order to allow the citizens to be prepared and skeptic and cynical and pessimistic in response to this, and give them the tools in order to rebel and to change things in case it starts to get really bad. But what the system has been so successful in America against this has actually been diluting this pessimism, destroying it, and replacing it with this intense optimism that the state has your best interest in mind, which to me is so. I understand if you're European or you exist in a more somewhat traditional culture, why you would think this. But as a person who exists in modernity, as a person in America in particular, this is such a crazy idea to me. This is so insane to me. This optimistic assumption that the government has your best interest in mind. And yet it seems so deeply, it doesn't matter if you're liberal or conservative or whatever in America, it seems so deeply ingrained. I think maybe since COVID, that idea has started to crack, maybe. But it's really, I don't know. I know you have a lot of thoughts on the American culture of America, Seraphim, so maybe you want to say something here. But to me, it's kind of flabbergasting.
Yeah, well, it's funny because we do want to do an American podcast, and I would like to delve more into that initial American spirit and what was going on in the minds of the founding fathers and how that's worked out.
Of course, they were also very naively optimistic in the idea that they could pull this off, but their optimism was at least balanced by this level of pessimism.
Yeah, and again, this is something I would like to explore more deeply in a later podcast. But I think, yeah, there is kind of this weird mismatch where there was a deep intention, yes, by the founding fathers to say, hey, we need to be able to account for tyranny taking over, and that there was a reason why there was the Second Amendment and the First Amendment, and there was a reason why the Anti-Federalists were really against the idea of creating even a standing army for the United States. That shouldn't even exist. It should be, if there needs to be a war, each state kind of comes together and brings their own boys together and sends them off. But there shouldn't be any kind of standing army. There was a lot of ideas of, this sort of balance that the government can never have too much control. There was, when they were trying to go from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, again, to try to say this for a separate podcast, there was this fear that when they were proposing the idea of an executive office led by one man, a lot of people were really scared about what that was going to be. It was very important for people like Madison that Washington were to take the first place as president, to kind of ease minds that people are like, Washington's going to be a level-headed guy. He's not going to try to be a tyrant. Even, and this is maybe likely made up, but so the story goes, King George, when he heard that Washington was president and was about to have his time to be done as president, said, he would be, if he were to actually step down as president, he would be the greatest man in the world, because there's no way he's going to step down from that office. And then he did. And that's probably made up. But, that was kind of a big deal. People were really, even when Washington became president, there was a sort of expectation he was going to become monarch in some fashion. And so with the founding fathers, there was this idea of that. There was a pessimism that yes, this system we're setting up could definitely unfold very easily into tyranny. But there was also this sort of optimism, and almost blind optimism, that they were going to have this very enlightened, spiritual culture, and that once they severed from Britain, the monarchy, it was just going to be this really kind of idyllic country of just, good Christian, whatever that meant, but, good spiritual Christian agricultural folks who just wanted to have their own little lives and their own little communities. And that was going to be the country. I mean, there was this sort of optimism that we were going to have a virtuous, idyllic little country. To some people like Hamilton and those guys, they did dream of empires very quickly. But it was a weird balance. It was a balance of we need to have these balances in place because we could become tyrannical very quickly. And also, no, the people are virtuous and this is going to work. We're going to be able to be a good democratic society. Well, obviously, that didn't work very well. And very quickly, very, very quickly, things got corrupted and the tyranny slipped in. And, of course, if you were to point to the virtue and spirituality of the people, that went away rather quickly as well. So it's kind of this balance of a blind hopefulness and also a pessimism from them as well.
Well, and I think something that modern people don't really understand well, or at least isn't conveyed well in education. I mean the sort of optimism and pessimism of, I want to move beyond the political dimension of this, but the way it's conveyed, I think is Proverbs or Psalms. It says something like, "Put not your faith in the kings of men, the princes of men." I think what a lot of modern people don't really comprehend is that despite all the immense respect historically for kings and monarchs and emperors, there is also the simultaneous pessimism that was just like, we're just fucked, we're just screwed, we can't expect very much. God save the king, and hopefully we get through this. I think what happens in modernity is a total 180. It's like there's very little actual regal, theological, metaphysical respect for the people who rule. In a certain way, there's even a universal cynicism on that level. But there is this weird optimism that despite that, it's all eventually going to work out. We're all going to sort this out. It's really just like the most idiotic possible worldview, and yet somehow it's become so immensely popular. It's kind of like a drug. It's just like something that you take and you don't really have to ask any more questions. It's just extremely comforting. Even amongst very neurotic people who are constantly paranoid and asking questions, this has become sort of the default ideology. Now, again, moving away from the political, we spent a lot of time on that, but moving more towards like the metaphysical. I talked about this before with like Ligotti and Turan. In Lovecraft is this sort of a cosmic, metaphysical, universal pessimism, and the way this manifests is like there's various routes. There's a very atheistic route, which is what you'll get in Lovecraft and Ligotti, which is God is absent, or it's like an Epicurean thing where the gods don't care about us, and we are preeminently alone, and to what degree there is other life, they don't have good intentions for us. And if you go back to Schopenhauer in particular, the will that forces us to operate, that by which we are basically slaves to, will never amount in such a way that the pleasure outweighs the bad. As Nietzsche puts this in Birth of Tragedy, as Midas captures Silenus, right? It is the great wisdom of Silenus that you get the prize if you capture Silenus, this devotee of Dionysus. It is best to have never been born, but having been born, to die as quickly as possible. And so this philosophy with antinatalism, basically this summation of that quote that it's best to not be born at all has gotten some traction lately with Benatar, this philosopher. I think he's South African. I'm not 100% sure on that. But and definitely with Ligotti, that the state of nature is such that no matter the amount of pleasure we have, it is always going to be outweighed by the negative. And of course, this also has an inherent assumption that suffering is always in every case going to be a bad thing. And I think that's a pretty strong assumption, because I think you could actually say that suffering in some cases is a good thing. I think if most people deeply search themselves, they would say they became better after periods of suffering. Not to say that suffering is intrinsically good. I don't know if I want to say that, but I want to say there are ways in which suffering is something that is in and of itself maybe bad, often operates as a good. And I think what antinatalism, though, although let me say I have a lot of sympathies with it, I think what a lot of antinatalists tend to just kind of run off the bat with is that suffering is in every single case a negative thing. Religions in all their forms are kind of dealing with this fundamental issue of suffering. It's either how do you just get rid of suffering right through, and I think Buddhism has the clearest answer to that, which is that you just negate existence altogether because existence is suffering. Or there's the Christian way, which is basically you embrace suffering because God himself suffers on the cross. I think Buddhism and Christianity kind of like fundamentally are the antipodal philosophical reactions to suffering, right? And on the one hand, you embrace it. On the other hand, you negate everything. Absolutely. And of course, I'm speaking very broadly. There are a lot of nuances in both of these antipodal relationships. But then there's this other side too. So there's this cosmic metaphysical suffering with this ultimate optimism. And we talked about in the podcast before with universalism, universal salvation. I don't want to get too much into it, but what I've noticed with I hang out in groups of like theological pessimists, and I hang out in groups of the universalists. And what I notice is that most universalists are generally like liberal, wine mom, kind of spiritually lax optimist in most cases. And then in the pessimist groups I'm in, it's like the exact opposite of that. Everything's bad. Most people are damned. And it's like, why not both? Like, why can't you just say like pretty much everything in human, as soon as humans touch it, it's shit. Everything is terrible. History is terrible. It only gets worse from here. We're all going to suffer terrible, painful, excruciating deaths. Most of us are going to hell, but maybe not internally, right? Maybe there is this like, it's like, to me, it's like the only reason I could be an optimist in a cosmic way is because I'm pessimist in every other sense. It's like it has to balance out in a way, intuitively, to me at least.
Yeah, you've said that to me before, and I'd actually like you to go. We're kind of reaching the end of the 50 minutes, but I'd like you to kind of maybe expand on that a little bit, because I do see these sort of two different sides where you do kind of get the pessimist, which is just sort of the life's it's shit. There's no real redemption, and you kind of get this sort of atheistic or just like who cares attitude, or you kind of get the optimist who is optimistic, but they're so, and I have a few good friends like this who they're optimistic and they realize the world, yeah, it's shit, but I'm optimistic and we're gonna make the world better. Like, I have this plan, or if you have this philosophy or this worldview or this spirituality, the world's gonna be a lot better. And I think it's neither one of those. It's like, no, it's not all shit. It's not all abyss. But also, you're not going to make this world better. This world is not going to ever be successful. Every kingdom of man you're going to make, if it's going to be fascist or communist or democratic or whatever, it's going to fail in some way. It goes back to Plato, right? Every civilization, no matter what government you put in is going to decline into something else. So there's never, you can be optimistic, but you can't be optimistic for this world. This world will never impress you. It'll never give you something that you want, other than maybe being in symbol pointing towards next world.
Well,
right?
for Plato, it's beauty. Beauty is what is in this world that leads us to the next. The eros of beauty.
But you have to be pessimistic about this world. You have to be pessimistic about this world, but optimistic about the next world. And I don't think I haven't really seen. I've either met very optimistic people who just want to be like, yeah, we're going to do all this stuff in this world, or very pessimistic people who are just like, nah, there's no saving anything. It's all damned. And it's like, it's not either. It's both.
And this is another thing that really
portion.
surprises me with modernity, because these ancient people, classical people, pre-modern people, they had this idea of as above, so below, vice versa, so on and so on. And they wouldn't have had maybe something like cosmic entropy on the second law of thermodynamics level that we do. But they had a basic understanding that the world's fate, even in a cyclical way, is always degenerating. And then maybe it's reborn and you have a golden age. So you go from the Kali Yuga, Dark Age, whatever, you have a golden age. But it's basically the cycle of time is degenerative by nature. And then we get into modernity and we get into thermodynamics and we actually have laws of entropy on the laws of physics. But it's like, I don't think you even have to have this like hermetic idea education to understand that, like, if the cosmos itself is slowly deteriorating in cosmic energy and atomic energy and the weak and strong nuclear forces, why do you think it would not be the same for politics? Like the political entropy, the cultural entropy, the genetic entropy, that it's actually the opposite of evolution. We're not evolving to a higher state. We're actually devolving. Our genetic code is getting worse with every generation, and cancer and all the other diseases are only going to get more intense and more common with each generation, to say nothing of all the bullshit chemicals they're putting in everything. We're becoming more susceptible to disease and sickness, despite all the medicinal advancements. It's that entropy consumes everything. Entropy consumes everything that exists. Only the things that are infinite, only the things that don't exist, are not going to be subject to entropy. And that's what optimism basically is. It's trying to find the infinite. It's trying to find the uncreated in the finite and in the created. That's its categorical error. Whereas pessimism, I mean, people also throw in this like realism thing, but I think that's a cop out. Peter Hitchens, Christopher Hitchens's brother.
No, I know Christopher.
So Christopher Hitchens is probably the best of like the whole new atheist, right? He kind of actually knew what he was talking about to some degree. Peter Hitchens is his brother, who actually, I think he's a convert to Christianity, but he said he's a pessimist, though. He's a pessimist Christian. But he says something to the effect that, like, I don't understand why anyone would be a pessimist, because you're never surprised, you're never let down. Everything. Yeah. It's like, oh, okay, well, I kind of expected this anyway. It's like, it only goes up. But it's funny because in practice, I am often surprised, assuming the worst already. I am often surprised by how much worse it was than what I was expecting. It's like you can never overestimate the idiocy of people. I think in George Carlin's skits he kind of nails this a lot, but it's like no matter how pessimistic you are, you're actually not being pessimistic enough. and that it's like, as someone, like, we're not talking about theory here, we're talking about praxis. It's like, if you actually try to be a pessimist, let's say you're just an optimist, try to be a pessimist for a week and see what your expectations are. The fact that your expectations are actually too optimistic when you're trying to be a pessimist, I think is just such a practical nail in the coffin for optimism. And the problem with optimism, again, aside from that categorical error, it puts faith in all the wrong things. Unless your optimism is like you're a fool for Christ, like your optimism is purely in God, but you're a pessimist everywhere else, right? That's kind of what I was saying from the get-go. Unless you're that kind of optimist, which I think is just, that's the ideal. Right. You're just screwing yourself over because you're putting your eggs in all this basket. Now, if you're an atheist, then just I understand like the whole Ligotti point at that point. I think Ligotti actually is the only intellectually honest atheist here. That's the only route to go. It's basically Camus, like, why not commit suicide? That's the only, at that point, that's the only serious philosophical question left. And unless you're saying it's just too much work to go through with it, I think every other answer is bullshit. But outside of that, to me, it's either that or, I mean, this goes to Dostoevsky too, right? It's antipodal. It's either that or the only thing to be an optimist about is God's mercy. everything in between that to me is just total idiocy and bullshit. It's basically Ecclesiastes. Like it's all smoke. It's all vanity. It's all meaninglessness. There's no point in it. You're fooling yourself. You're just making your life more difficult. And the sooner you swallow that pill, and I think it's very important to have children from a very early age kind of understand this. And if you're reading the mythology, if you're reading the biblical stories, it should be instilled to them naturally. The problem with so much of children's literature and children's movies is that it instills a very corruptive idea of optimism that does not prepare them for the way the world actually is. What was so brilliant about things like Grimm's fairy tales and mythologies and almost any religious text you could read children is that it had a very wise view of how things work, that humans are shit, that the universe is shit, that everything is conspiring against us. And that's just how you have to swallow it, and you have to make the best of it. But what you see, it's kind of like Plato says, like, if you really want to do politics, don't be a politician. I mean, it's not at first. Like, be someone who writes stories for children. And this is why I pay so much attention to any children's film that comes out, because that's really where political ideology is. That's really where you are determining the future of the world. And again, I think maybe we talked about this on the podcast before, but the only children's film I've seen in the last like 20, 30 years that I have any respect for is Coco. Which in a way is an optimistic film, but I think it's a justified optimism about metaphysics, about the afterlife, and about the continual relationship between ancestors and one's current family. Pretty much every other children's film is extremely ideological in like the optimist bullshit way. Okay. Sorry.
No, go ahead, because I
was going to end it. You go ahead.
Well, we probably should end it, but I was just gonna say I was thinking about that just a couple of days ago, the film Coco, and I remember you showed it to me, and you were like, oh, Seraphim, and I never really watched Pixar or Disney or whatever the hell it is films, and you're like, no, you should watch this one, it's good, and so we watched it. I'm like, oh, wow, that was really actually a good film. But it's funny because I've seen a lot of I've been watching on YouTube recently a lot of critiques of modern Disney. And like how it's all kind of shit now, and everyone gives kind of their reasons why, and I think they kind of get on the point, but sometimes not. But consistently, what I feel like people say is like a good, like, oh, but what's an exception? Like what's actually a good Disney film is in Encanto, which is the Colombian film. Yeah,
Encanto? No, that is the worst children's film I've ever seen.
And we both watched that, and I'm Colombian, and it's a film about Colombians. So I was really wanting to like this film, and I mean, we watched this, and we were both like,
one they're saying is the exception.
Yeah, they're like, this is an exception. Like, I'm like, this is like emblematic of everything wrong with Disney. Like that film is so terrible. I wanted to love it, and it's so bad.
That's crazy.
That's a conversation for another day. I'm sorry, but I was just thinking, like, no one ever mentions Coco. No one ever mentions Coco. Like that to me, that's like, because I've started watching other films, and I'm like, no, that was slept on. Is the standout. Yeah,
it got slept on. It was too powerful. It got repressed.
No, it really was, because I mean, it really did actually have that kind of understanding of. It actually kind of did respect the Mexican Day of the Dead, tradition, and it kind of went into that. But it really had that emphasis on ancestry and I don't know. There was a lot of spiritual stuff going on in that film.
Also, the music was actually decent.
The music was good, whereas the music in Canto was terrible.
It was insane. Someone insane composed that music. Whoever it was.
Literally Lin-Manuel Miranda.
If we lived in a just society, that person, if not put to death, would be forbidden from ever composing music again.
What's really funny, I do want to do the American podcast because that was Lin-Manuel Miranda who did write Hamilton. That's his claim to fame, and I think
I haven't seen it.
Yeah, I have a lot of problems.
It seems very ideological to me.
Oh, yeah, it's very ideological in a very bad way. But anyways, that's a conversation for another time.
All right, well we'll end it there. Again, if you have comments or questions, email or leave a comment, and we'll try to get back to you. All right. Until next time. Thank you for tuning in to 15-Minute Hour. You can find us on Spotify and iTunes, and at least some of our uploads on YouTube. You can reach out to us at cbanta125@msn.com with any questions, comments, or concerns. Until then, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.